Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. I'd firstly like to thank Debal of NTV for inviting me on his show this morning. This is a photograph of Nation Media House taken at 5 to 6 in the morning. I also came across Linus after the show. We had a little chat. Of course, he was holed up in there one night. He didn't dwell on that. It was a pleasure joining Mike Eldon, Gabriel Negati, myself, Habila Olaka and James Muroi to discuss the state of the economy. Macro thoughts. Over the weekend I said the markets worldwide exited its halcyon days on Friday, and we're still trying to see what the exit is actually going to look like. And I was saying on that show this morning, we had a Goldilocks period, and President Trump cloaked his administration in the righteousness of the markets. And then I was asked what triggered recent volatility. Was the wage inflation in the United States, which made people worry about higher interest rates. Bond yields then spiked higher. Before this sharp sell-off in the equity markets allowed people to nibble back at their bonds. So it was quite an interesting scenario, quite volatile, and I was describing the preceding period as a halcyon moment. Home thoughts, more photos from the Falcon Heavy's first flight, SpaceX. Really, it's a remarkable thing Elon Musk is doing. Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, was ridiculed for his use of the word people kind. And I agree with him, actually. The language and linguistics are an important part of the liberation struggle in many respects. DNA shows the first modern Briton had dark skin and blue eyes. London scientists said on Wednesday, following groundbreaking DNA analysis of the remains of a man who lived 10,000 years ago. Known as Cheddar Man after the area in southwest England where his skeleton was discovered in a cave in 1903, the ancient man has been brought to life through the first ever full DNA analysis of his remains. It maybe gets rid of the idea that you have to look a certain way to be from somewhere. We are all immigrants. Powerful, isn't it, really? Annals of Gastronomy, the Syrian baker who's bringing the Middle East's most famous ice cream to California, New Yorker. Bakdash, the most celebrated ice cream parlor in the Middle East, is a 138-year-old shop located in the Al-Hamidiyya Souk, an Ottoman-era marketplace in Damascus's old city. Men in butcher caps, white gloves and coats staff the long, narrow space serving customers who over the decades have included King Faisal of Iraq, Tony Blair and Lawrence of Arabia. But the real spectacle is toward the back of the store, where younger men in tight white t-shirts stand behind chilled buckets, wielding giant wooden pestles. They rhythmically pound what's inside boozer, an ice cream made with mastic, a tree resin that's the key component of chewing gum, and saleh, a flour derived from orchid roots. Those two ingredients and the vigorous beating give boozer its distinctive consistency of cold, stretchy taffy. And all of this is made by a contraption which looks like a taco cart wheeled rectangular waist high, with a compressor and a freezer instead of a gas tank and a built-in steel tub that chills the ice cream to 40 degrees below zero. Nakhal commissioned a handcrafted brass bas-relief to decorate its sides. It features a man who stands behind a similar machine as he holds a pestle, almost as large as he is. Above the man in Arabic are the words Arabic ice cream. We tasted the boozer, which was milky and chewy like a chilled, melted marshmallow. The rose water added sweetness, the pistachios crunch, and a slight toastiness. I noticed a familiar aftertaste, a bit like licorice, that I couldn't quite place. You're thinking of horchata, Hamida told me, referring to the rice water drink that's popular among Latin Americans. It's the salad, it tastes like it, she said. That's why Arabs love horchata. Maher Nakhal, imported the kind of ice cream machine used in the historic parlor Bakdash in Damascus, said, I wanted to bring my childhood back to the United States. This is a photograph of the city of London taken by Georgy Kanchev, which I liked. This is the photographer's Edward C. Robinson III, and it's a photograph of Black Unity by Elizabeth Catlett. And finally, photography by APJD members Hilna Adebe. Take a look at that as well. Political reflections. Kim Jong-un named his sister to represent North Korea at the Winter Olympics. And there's quite a bit of jostling going on, isn't there? Pence was sort of trying to put some more iron in the South Koreans. The South Koreans seem quite excited at this rapprochement. With eyes on the Indian Ocean, new players rush into the Horn of Africa, war on the rocks. A race is underway between Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Turkey to build naval and military bases right across the Horn of Africa. The strategic order in the Indian Ocean is changing fast. In the last few years, we've seen major powers such as China and India building new bases in the Western Indian Ocean. But we're now witnessing several Middle Eastern players building their own areas of influence. This is happening in the Horn of Africa, but it is likely to spread further into the Indian Ocean. Saudi Arabia has recently finalized a deal to establish a naval base in Djibouti. Its UAE ally has just built major naval and air facilities at Assad in nearby Eritrea. The UAE also runs a military training center in Mogadishu, in Somalia, and is rumored to be seeking access to port and air facilities at Berbera in the breakaway province of Somaliland. In recent weeks, Turkey signed a deal with Sudan to rebuild the old Ottoman-era port of Suakin on the Red Sea, which will reportedly include naval facilities. The immediate imperative behind these moves in the Horn of Africa is the growing rivalry between the two Middle Eastern blocs, Saudi Arabia, UAE and Egypt on one side, and Turkey, Iran and Qatar on the other. A proxy conflict between these rival blocs in Yemen has a strong naval element, with the Houthi rebels being supplied by sea. This base race is symptomatic of bigger strategic aspirations of several non-traditional middle powers in the Indian Ocean region. The Emirates, a regional rival of Turkey, is also spreading its wings. Long had aspirations in the Indian Ocean far beyond the Yemen conflict. The UAE has given considerable financial and political support to small island states such as the Comoros, Maldives, Seychelles, Mauritius, and it is a large investor in East Africa. Just as importantly, the base race by new middle powers demonstrates just how multipolar and complex the Indian Ocean is likely to become. For countries such as Australia, the Indian Ocean will not only involve working with major powers such as the United States, India and China, or allies such as France and Japan. It seems there will be a host of other players, each with their own agendas and alignments. And I concluded by saying it's quite exponential, the level of activity, particularly that Horn of Africa area. August 2013, I said I have no doubt that the Indian Ocean is set to regain its glory days, and I was essentially thinking of what we're seeing now. Professor Felipe Fernandez Amesto explains why the precocity of the Indian Ocean as a zone of long-range navigation and cultural exchange is one of the glaring facts of history, made possible by the reversible escalator of the monsoon. The monsoon wind would take you from somewhere like India all the way down to Maputo, then it would turn around and it would take you all the way back. I said then, in 2013, I have no doubt that the Indian Ocean is set to regain its glory days. China's dependence on imported crude oil is increasing, and the US's is interestingly decreasing. I am also certain that the eastern seaboard of Africa from Mozambique through Somalia is the last great energy prize of this 21st century of ours. Therefore, the control of the Indian Ocean becomes kind of decisive, and with control, China can be shut down quite quickly. A sine qua non of President Obama's pivot to Asia is US NATO power projection over the Indian Ocean. And on that note, this is a photograph of Ali the navigator, who was navigating us along the Indian Ocean on our way to Wasini Island. When Abe Shinzo, the Prime Minister of Japan, visited Kenya and I went to that TCAD conference, he said this: Japan bears the responsibility of fostering the confluence of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. December 2013, I said Indian Ocean in many respects is right in the geopolitical frame. And I was talking about, the Americans had this concept of distant blockade operations, and I said one of the places they'd have to be blockading at a distance would be the Indian Ocean. Island paradise becomes latest flashpoint in India-China rivalry. Power struggle in the Maldives, a tiny Indian Ocean nation known for scenic luxury resorts and crystal clear blue water, is taking center stage in a wider battle for regional influence between India and China. Yemen declared a state of emergency on Monday. State of emergency after the Supreme Court ordered him to free political prisoners and opposition politicians he's thrown in jail. Security forces then stormed the court and arrested 2 judges, as well as a former leader. The remaining judges later annulled the previous ruling, the AP reported on Wednesday. The political drama sparked concern in India, who said last week in an unusually strong statement that it's imperative for the government to obey the Supreme Court. China, which signed a free trade agreement with the Maldives last year, said Tuesday the country of roughly 400,000 people has the wisdom and capabilities to cope with the current situation independently. Badra Kumar, who writes in the Asia Times, says Maldives crisis US-Indian strategic alliance form. Developments in Maldives have begun unfolding according to script. India, the US, and Britain spearheading the demand that the Maldivian President Abdullah Yameen comply with the order by his country's Supreme Court to release his political opponents from prison and reinstate 12 former lawmakers as members of parliament. The script has a striking resemblance to what happened in Sri Lanka in 2014, with some minor variations on the fundamental theme: regime change. Thus, as in Sri Lanka, sworn enemies who had been at each other's throats for decades suddenly made strange bedfellows to oust the strong man in the presidential palace, and as dawn broke one fine day, the ground beneath the regime shifted dramatically. The real US-Indian game plan is to create a second island chain, similar to the one in the Western Pacific, connecting the Maldives with Diego Garcia and Seychelles, where India has a base on one of the islands, and has just concluded an agreement to build an airstrip and a sophisticated monitoring station to curb the presence of Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean, and to control the sea lanes through which China conducts the bulk of its foreign trade. By the way, the US and India closely cooperate in monitoring the presence of Chinese submarines in the Indian Ocean. I'm sure there are plenty of them. So, we've got a real geopolitical, moving parts colliding all over the place, but really bringing out the centrality of the Indian Ocean was the point. 1001 is a prosecutor's best friend. This is the perjury trap. I don't see President Trump falling for that at all. US jets bomb pro-regime forces in Syria simultaneously. Israeli warplanes target Syrian military positions. You can see that they're trying to roll back some of the Syrian government's gains. Let's move on to currency markets. Euro dollar 122.70, so considerably below those levels above 125 that we visited not too long ago. Dollar index claws its way back above 90 at 90.24, Japanese yen 109.54, Swiss franc 0.9442, the pound 138.86, the Australian dollar 0.7833, India rupee 64.185, South Korean won 1087.65. The Rial is at 327.16, Egyptian pound 17.6313, and the Rand back above 12.0610. Probably, if you look 4 weeks, in 4 weeks' time, you're going to make out like a bandit buying it at 12.06. Dollar index, here's a chart from T Commodity. As I said, we didn't get down to 88, which was my initial target, and I think we're going to firm up a bit more from here. Euro dollar, take a look at this chart from T Commodity as well, 122.64. The structure of Bitcoin, I wrote on the 2nd of January, is, however, one that lends itself to being short squeezed, and being short squeezed is not a pleasant sensation, let me assure you. And then we learned the mother of all bubbles rose 43% from the dip the previous day. We're currently now at 8,250, having just been this week alone below 6,000. Dr. Nouriel Rubini said Bitcoin is the mother of all bubbles and its bubble is now bursting. Have a look at the latest video he has posted. Most cryptos are still down at least 30% on a weekly basis, according to CoinDesk. Jim Yong King of the World Bank said in terms of using Bitcoin or some of the cryptocurrencies, we're also looking at it. But I'm told the vast majority of cryptocurrencies are basically Ponzi schemes. Deutsche Bank shares plunged to a crisis level, has now fallen 19.6% since the beginning of the year, by far the steepest drop in the Bloomberg 500 Europe Bank Index. Commodity markets, gold, down at 13.12. You remember we were above 13.50 not too long ago. WTI crude oil, that's also losing ground, $61.44. US government data showed US crude production jumped to a record 10.25 million barrels a day last week. In August 2015, President Obama used that gusher to put pressure on the oil price in order to use the oil price as a geopolitical spear. I wrote then, President Obama, oil warfare specialist, advanced the US national interest by using the price of oil as a geopolitical spear. And you can see that, the more they produce, it's basically they've become the sweet producer. Emerging markets, Brazil's central bank cut its key interest rate by 25 basis points to a record low. Let's move on to Africa. Sétif sous la neige, Radio Algerie. This is from Algeria. Look at the snow. Joseph Kabila will not stand in the next DRC elections, his aide has said. Lambert Mende said Kabila, who's been in office since 2001, had never intended to seek a third term and would not seek to appoint a candidate to represent his interests in the polls, currently scheduled for December. This is not a kingdom where the king appoints an heir, it is a democratic republic, he said. Kabila's second term as president expired in December 2016 and has been accused of deliberately delaying preparations for a new poll, otherwise called glissement. This was his only option. He had to try and manage the exit, the departure, but managing any departure is very difficult. Ask Dos Santos. US abdication in Africa hands political opportunities to China, writes David Pilling in the Financial Times. From the South China Sea to the Middle East, the US is losing its status as an unrivaled superpower. In few places is this loss of influence so apparent as in Africa, where Beijing senses a strategic opportunity and where Washington is increasingly viewed as a fickle, even absentee ally. If there is a mirror image of Donald Trump's America First policy, it is to be found in the world's poorest continent. You could call it Africa Last. Cannot help noticing the Africa-shaped hole where Washington's African strategy should be. The US, says Mo Ibrahim, a Sudanese telecoms billionaire and a champion of better governance, has lost its authority to act as the leader of the liberal world and the backbone of the international order. America's shrinking influence in Africa, the second largest continent geographically, an epicenter of a gathering population explosion, did not begin under Mr. Trump. There is no high policy, at least none that I can find, says John Campbell, former US ambassador to Nigeria and senior fellow for Africa policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Mr. Campbell points out, there are non-commercial reasons to think harder about Africa. By 2050, the number of Africans will have doubled to more than 2 billion and may double again by the end of the century. Within a generation or so, Nigeria is expected to surpass the US to become the world's third most populous country. Accusations surfaced last month that Beijing had routinely bugged the $200 million headquarters of the African Union built in Addis Ababa. The muted African response suggested there were no secrets between friends. I don't think there's anything done here that we would not like people to know, said Paul Kagame. At least he seemed to be saying the Chinese were listening. My piece, China Rising, refers to that. The link is on which wrap-ups. Zimbabwe is negotiating a $1.5 billion guarantee with the Afrexim Bank. So the central bank government, they can pull that off. They're going, the ruling party will be enjoying a significant tailwind into the election. Pierre Nkurunziza said a recent report accusing China of spying on the African Union is groundless. So we know. Sudan's annual inflation rate is currently 128%, the second highest in the world. It has recently surpassed South Sudan, which is the third highest inflation rate in the world. South African all shares down 4.4% this year. Dollar versus rand put up a 6-month chart. It's a buy. Sooner rather than later, President Zuma will have gone, and the rand will be at 11. Egyptian pound 17.6313. Nigerian all share up 13.85% so far this year, double Nairobi and more. Ghana Stock Exchange up 25.33% so far this year. Finding Raptor, East Africa's lost Roman-era city. You'll have to go to Rich Wrap-Ups to read about that story. Kenya to pick Citibank, JP Morgan to advise on Eurobond sale. The ministry also chose Standard Chartered Bank, Standard Bank Group's Kenya's unit Stanbic Holdings to help with the sales of the people who asked not to be identified because the appointment hasn't been made public yet. Treasury Secretary Henry Rotich didn't answer 2 calls on his mobile Wednesday, while Treasury Director of Budget Geoffrey Weil declined to comment when asked about the planned sale on Tuesday. The Treasury will seek to raise between $1.5 billion to $3 billion in bonds with a tenor of up to 15 years. JP Morgan, Citi, Standard Chartered and Stanbic declined to comment. Kenya's government plans to raise $3.2 billion from external sources in the fiscal year that ends June 30. The government has already raised $750 million commercially this year through a loan from a syndicate of lenders led by Trade and Development Bank. The funds will be used to settle 5-year Eurobonds maturing in June 2019 and retire an $800 million syndicated loan taken in 2016. Yields on Kenya's existing $2 billion of Eurobonds due in June 2024 have dropped almost 130 basis points to 6.03% last, having got as low as 5.45% on January the 8th this year. I'm glad to see that the Treasury is moving with some dispatch. Here's a chart of yields on Kenya's $2 billion of Eurobonds. Raila Odinga calls for new elections when he's interviewed in an interview with BBC Hard Talk Zainab Badawi. The economy needs another election like a hole in the head. Raila Odinga himself has not been arrested. Any move to detain him would likely spark violent street protests, so it certainly would. It would be a very bad idea, and at times I think he's rather wishing they would arrest him. The Kenyan crackdown continues. The US needs to respond, wrote the Washington Post. President Trump is not fond of the Washington Post. Kenya shilling 101.30, which is a 17-month high. Nairobi all shares up 4.04% so far this year. It stumbled yesterday on quite strong volume and on the day before. Nairobi NSE 20 is up 0.47% so far this year. Tallow oil, East Africa. This is the Mark McFarlane, EVP East Africa. The exploration and appraisal campaign in Kenya has confirmed the presence of substantial oil resources in the South Lokichar Basin. East Africa is on the verge of becoming a major oil exporting region, he said. Seaboard and Victus offered to buy out Unga shareholders. This is a story on Bank Kalele's blog. Seaboard Corporation of Delaware, acting in conjunction with Victus Limited, the majority owner of Unga, has offered to buy out other minority shareholders at 40 shillings a share, delist the company shares from the Nairobi Securities Exchange. Unga is up 0.86% so far this year, trades on a trading P of 6.77 and has a market cap of 2.2 billion shillings. Total Kenya is up 22.34% so far this year. Capitalism has to be Darwinian, I said on this earlier this morning. And finally, this is Jimmy Wanjigi's response to the obituary notice that was placed in The Nation.